Want to also let you know that we have devotions for Advent and Christmas that are in, and you can find these in the narthex. These are wonderful, just one page for practically every day. They're very well done. I enjoy them, and these are good for personal and family devotions, and you can get it for the very low cost of free. So make sure you pick one up on the way out. So when I was 12 years old, I thought that the world was going to end. The year was 1984, and one night I was channel surfing. I think it was a Friday night, trying to find something interesting to watch on television when I came across a show featuring the Reverend Jerry Falwell. And he was talking about 1984 and what would happen that year. He predicted 1984 was to be the year that Christ would come or the world would end. All right, talk about being positive, Pastor Falwell. So no matter what happened the rest of the year in my life, I could not shake Falwell's prediction. I mean, I had so many plans. Sadly, a lot of them surrounded me wanting to be a professional wrestler, but that is another sermon for another time. So when 1985 finally came around, I was in a much better mood. But ever since that fateful night, I have had an interest in the end times. Not so much the end times, but the people who predict the end times. People like Hal Lindsey, who wrote the famous book, The Late Great Planet Earth, that predicted the end was near in the early 70s. Of course, he then wrote a sequel, the 1980s. This time he included the whole decade just to make sure he had his bases covered. Or people like Harold Camping, a preacher who rose to fame because he predicted the end of the world 11 times. Now, one of the misconceptions is that end times is a Christian thing, but people from all over the world and all different religions can go a little overboard. How many of you remember when Halley's Comet came in 1986? Okay, pretty fun event. Not so fun if you were living in 1910, because the nearness of its approach back then created a worldwide panic stoked by media and newspaper headlines like, "Comet may kill all Earth life, says scientist." The panic became so bad that a group in Oklahoma tried to sacrifice a virgin to ward off impending doom. Oh, and bottled air became a hot commodity. Bottled air. I'm just going to say that, make sure everybody understands that, and then we'll move on. Now, how many of you remember Y2K? Computers supposedly would not know how to react to a 00 date, and thus the world would go into total chaos. The internet would go down, and people would be running out in the streets. And I remember I was at seminary at the time, but during the break, I was working at Barnes & Noble. And the minute we opened the store on January 2nd, year 2000, all the books that predicted doom and gloom went on sale for 75 to 90% off. And then there was the Mayan apocalypse in 2012, December 21st, 2012 to be exact, which many misinterpreted as a connection to the end of the Mayan calendar. And for some reason, it involved things like huge tidal waves, a realignment of the Earth's axis. Oh, and by the way, Earth colliding with an imaginary planet called Nibiru. There was a man in China who even built a modern-day Noah's Ark just in case, and survival kits were all the rage. So we as people, not just Christians, really spend a lot of time thinking about the end. Maybe it's just me, but it feels like a lot of us just can't wait until that day comes. We're really eager for the world to end. Sure, for us to be saved, but I think sadly, more importantly, I think a lot of Christians think it is the day that all the people that they hate or have been taught to hate will finally burn and be damned forever. And we want to be there to see it. That is why I am glad that we have a season of Advent. It is a season where we are directed by God to stop looking at the end times through human eyes and to start looking at the end time through the eyes of God. Throughout Advent, we will be reading a lot from Isaiah. And these readings paint a large picture of what God's coming and what God's rescue looks like. Now, the book of Isaiah actually starts with something I like to call the fall well. And what that means is that the first vision that the prophet shares with Israel is not filled with good news, but rather God's disappointment in his people. God's people have rebelled against him. They have forgotten who their creator is. So God uses medical images to describe this rebellion as an illness. From chapter 1, God says the whole head is sick and the whole heart is faint. And to deal with this sickness, God is going to bring judgment and wrath. So it doesn't look good. But then we get to chapter 2 in our lesson for today. Now, God moves away from a vision of destruction to a vision of restoration. In fact, the location of our lesson is important to note because it tells us where God's house is found. God's house is on top of the mountain. And on this mountain, God will teach Israel his ways and show his children how to walk in his path. And on this mountain, there will be an end time. There will be an end to war, which is big news for a country that has been in constant battle with its neighboring countries. For only a small time in its history was Israel ever in a state of peace. Most of the time, it was in a state of violence and chaos. So to know that God will bring an end to war is certainly wonderful news to the people. This version of the end times is actually a promise that God will come and that God will act. So, the people need not look at the end through their eyes, but through the eyes of the God who loves them and the God who will save them. All they need to do is wait, watch, and be prepared. And not to be fooled into thinking they know when it will happen. And that is what Jesus talks about in our gospel. In the gospel, Jesus shares with his disciples 4 examples to emphasize that they cannot know when the big event will occur. The first 3 involve Noah's Ark and the disappearances of people. In talking about Noah's Ark, Jesus focuses on how sudden the flood comes. Before the flood, people carried on with their daily lives, eating, drinking, being merry, but they know nothing about the future events until suddenly the flood came and swept them all away. The second and third examples feature 4 people at work, and suddenly 2 people are taken away. Now, many jump to the conclusions that the ones who disappeared are the saved ones. But Jesus never reveals where they are taken. Who is to say that the ones left behind are not the saved ones? Who is to say the ones who disappeared are not the ones who face wrath? The point is, we cannot say that. And that is not the point that Jesus is making. The point Jesus is making is that, like the flood, there is a suddenness to the second coming, which leads to the fourth and final example, where the homeowner did not know when and where a thief was coming. Had the householder possessed such information, he would be waiting and watching and prepared, and he would have prevented the break-in. Jesus wants us to be ready, to be prepared. But that's not all Jesus wants us to be. Jesus also wants us to be patient. And we cannot stand not knowing when that day is, if we are to be honest with one another. We want to know, and we want to know now. But the lesson I learned all those years ago from watching people like Reverend Falwell and others talk about the end is this: even Jesus doesn't know. Even Jesus does not know. Only God the Father knows, and He ain't telling. So the next time some preacher says he or she knows when the end times will happen, you, all of us, we have the courage and the certainty to say, last time I checked, your name, your first name isn't God, and your last name isn't Almighty. So please, please be careful when you hear someone say that they know the date. They don't, and they never will. So when it comes to the end times, I believe we need to stop looking to the end and work on the now. As Isaiah says in our lesson, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that He may teach us His ways, and that we may walk in His paths. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. I believe, and I urge all of you, to do what Isaiah and Jesus both tell us to do. Be prepared, be ready, but also live in the now. Live now. Love now. Forgive now. Ask for forgiveness now. Serve God now. Serve our neighbors now. Live in the now and rest in the now. Rest in the knowledge that God has got the end times handled. God has the end times cradled in the same arms that hold us when we are scared and when we are frightened. The same arms that stretched out to be nailed to a piece of wood. The same arms that reached out to His mother Mary in the manger, where the reason for this season has come, and it will come again. Let us live in the now, and God will handle the later. Amen.